Sign it, old man. You've been making bad decisions your whole life anyway. Time to let someone else take the wheel. Those were the exact words my son Marcus said to me the morning he drove me to what he called a family property in rural Tennessee. A rotting farmhouse buried so deep in the hills that the nearest gas station was 11 miles away. He didn't say it with anger. He said it the way you'd tell a dog to sit. Flat. Final. Like the matter was already settled and my feelings were just noise he'd learned to tune out. 2 weeks later, he called me 31 times in a single day. I didn't answer once, but I'm getting ahead of myself. For you to understand what happened on that dirt road in Harlan County, you need to know who I was before everything fell apart and who I became when there was nothing left to lose. My name is Harold Benton. I'm 64 years old. For 38 years, I worked as a master electrician out of Knoxville, Tennessee. I wired houses, factories, schools, and hospitals. I understood systems, how power flows, how circuits connect, how one bad connection can bring down the whole grid. I thought I understood people the same way. I was wrong about that for longer than I care to admit. Ruth was the best thing that ever happened to me. We met at a church potluck in 1983, and I spent the next 36 years trying to deserve her. She was a hospice nurse, the kind of woman who held strangers' hands while they died and still came home and made dinner and asked about my day. She had this particular laugh that started slow and built until her whole body shook, and I spent 3.5 decades trying to make her do it as often as possible. 2 years ago, Ruth was diagnosed with a fast-moving form of pancreatic cancer. From diagnosis to her last breath was 4 months and 11 days. She went on a Thursday afternoon in October, holding my hand, telling me not to cry, which was the one instruction I was never able to follow. Marcus showed up at the funeral looking exactly the way you'd want a son to look. Press suit, red eyes, arm around my shoulder. He gave a eulogy that made half the room weep. He called Ruth the most selfless woman he'd ever known. He said she'd be proud of the family she'd built. People came up to me afterward and said, "You must be so grateful to have a son like that." I was. God help me, I was. The cracks started small. Within a month of Ruth's passing, Marcus began stopping by the house with his wife Diane, always with some reason to go through paperwork. "Dad, you've got accounts scattered everywhere. Dad, your insurance policies are a mess. Dad, let me and Diane sit down with you and get things organized." And I let them. Because when you're drowning in grief, any hand reaching down looks like a lifeline. You don't stop to check whether it's actually pulling you up or just using you to stay afloat itself. I signed things at the kitchen table where Ruth and I had eaten 36 years of dinners. I signed things in Marcus's car, engine running, him explaining each document in that calm, reassuring tone he'd apparently been practicing. I signed things I didn't read because he told me they were just formalities, just paperwork protecting my assets in case anything happened to me. I trusted him with the same uncomplicated faith I'd trusted him with when he was 8 years old and told me he hadn't broken the garage window. The property came up gradually. It had belonged to Ruth's family for 3 generations, 40 acres of hilly land outside a small town called Crab Orchard, about 90 minutes from our house in Knoxville. There was an old farmhouse on it. Hadn't been lived in since Ruth's aunt passed in the late 90s. We'd always talked about fixing it up someday, retiring there, sitting on the porch and watching the hills go gold in October. It never happened because some days have a way of becoming some days forever. Marcus started calling it the liability property. "Too much maintenance, Dad. The county's been sending notices. There's back taxes owed. It's just sitting there bleeding money." He said it like the land itself was some kind of drain I'd been foolish enough to keep. And I, still raw with grief, still waking up every morning and forgetting for one merciful second that Ruth was gone, nodded along and signed what he put in front of me. 3 months after Ruth died, my name was no longer on that deed. It took me another 2 months to understand what had actually happened. I found a property tax notice addressed to Marcus and Diane at my house. They'd started using my address for various things, and something in the wording made me slow down and read carefully for the first time in months. I drove to the county clerk's office. I sat in a plastic chair and waited while a woman behind the counter pulled the records. She slid the paper across the desk without meeting my eyes. The 40 acres had been transferred to Marcus and Diane Benton 6 weeks earlier. Every piece of it, including the mineral rights. I confronted Marcus that evening at his house. Diane sat at the kitchen island on her phone, not looking up. Marcus leaned against the counter with his arms crossed, and the patient expression of a man explaining basic arithmetic to someone very slow. "Dad, we talked about this. We did not talk about this. You talked and I signed something you said was about insurance beneficiaries. It was a combined document. You would have caught it if you'd read it. That sentence, you would have caught it if you'd read it, told me everything I needed to know about what my son had decided I was worth. I hired an attorney. She reviewed everything and gave me the news with the gentle precision of someone who'd given bad news many times before. The documents were drafted in a way that was technically legal, if profoundly unethical. Marcus hadn't forged anything. He'd just handed a grieving old man a stack of papers and counted on love and exhaustion to do the rest. She told me I could contest it, but that contesting would be expensive, slow, and uncertain. She told me to go home and think carefully. Marcus called me 2 days later. He'd heard I'd spoken to a lawyer. "Dad, I did this to protect the family. If you pursue this, we're looking at years of legal battles. Is that really how you want to spend the time you have left, fighting your own son? The time you have left?" As if 64 was already the closing credits. After that call, things between us deteriorated fast. Marcus stopped coming by. Diane, who had always been cool toward me, went fully cold. The grandchildren, Marcus's 2 teenagers, went quiet in the way teenagers do when adults have told them something is complicated without telling them what it actually is. I was alone in the Knoxville house with Ruth's reading glasses still on the nightstand and a freezer full of casseroles the neighbors had brought that I couldn't bring myself to eat. Then one Saturday in March, Marcus called and said he needed to discuss the crab orchard property. He said there was a situation with the farmhouse that needed attention immediately. He said he'd pick me up at 8 in the morning and we'd drive out together and figure it out. I should have asked more questions. I didn't. The drive out was quiet in a way that felt engineered. Marcus answered when I spoke, but didn't initiate conversation. He kept both hands on the wheel. He was wearing work boots and old jeans, which struck me as odd. Marcus never did physical work if he could avoid it. He'd married a woman whose father owned 3 car dealerships, and they lived the kind of life where things were handled by people you hired. He didn't own work boots, or he hadn't, last I'd checked. An hour and a half into the drive, we turned off the state road onto a county road, then off the county road onto a gravel track that cut through scrub forest. The farmhouse appeared in a clearing 2 stories of weathered gray wood, porch half collapsed, windows boarded where they weren't broken outright, chimney listing to one side like a man who's had too much to drink and hasn't fallen only because the wall is holding him up. Marcus stopped the truck and got out. He pulled a duffel bag from the back seat and set it on the ground. Then he pulled out my overnight bag, the small one I kept packed in the hallway closet because Ruth had always insisted on being ready to travel. "Marcus," I said, "what is this?" "The house needs a caretaker while we figure out what to do with it." He said it to the tree line, not to me. "You've got your tools in the bag. There's canned food in the house. Phone signal's weak, but it's there. I'm not staying here." He finally looked at me. And I want to say I saw guilt in his face. I want to say I saw some fragment of the boy I'd raised, the one I'd taught to ride a bike and helped through algebra and sat with in the emergency room at 2 in the morning when he broke his arm at 17 and was terrified to call his mother. But what I saw was a decision that had already been made and filed away. "The house is ours now, Dad. You can contest that in court if you want, but until you do, you're a guest on our property. A guest we're offering shelter to." He picked up the duffel bag and walked it to the porch steps, setting it down carefully, like the gesture of care was supposed to balance out the rest of it. "I'll be in touch about next steps. Marcus." My voice came out steadier than I felt. "Look at me." He did, just for a moment. "You're going to regret this." He got back in the truck. He pulled away down the gravel track without accelerating, almost slowly, like he was giving me time to call after him, and he'd already prepared himself not to hear it. I stood in that clearing for a long time. The farmhouse sagged behind me. The woods were quiet except for a woodpecker working somewhere in the distance. I was 64 years old, alone on a property I'd been removed from, with a duffel bag, a phone with 2 bars of signal, and whatever was left of the stubbornness that had kept me employed in a physical trade for 4 decades. I walked up the porch steps carefully, testing each one. 2 held, 1 cracked through. I made a mental note and went inside. The interior was worse than the exterior suggested. The ceiling in the main room had partially caved in, letting in a column of gray March sky. The kitchen still had its original 1950s fixtures, a cast-iron sink, a wood-burning cook stove, cabinets so warped they couldn't close. But the floors were solid heart pine, dense as stone under the grime, and the walls, beneath the water damage and the peeling paper, were plaster over lath, built to last in a way nobody builds anymore. My electrician's eyes started cataloging automatically. Power line ran to the house, but had been cut at the meter. There was a gravity-fed cistern on the hill behind the property. I could see the rusted pipe outlet above the kitchen sink. If the cistern still collected rainwater, I'd have water. The wood stove, if the flue was clear, would give me heat and cooking. My hands already knew what to do, even when the rest of me was still catching up to the situation. The first week was the hardest. The nights were cold. March in Tennessee, hill country is not forgiving, and the wood stove's flue was partially blocked with a decade of debris. I cleared it with a length of wire I found in the barn and burned through half the wood someone had stacked and forgotten years ago. I slept in my coat the first 3 nights. I ate canned soup heated on the stove and crackers from my bag, and tried not to think about the house in Knoxville where Ruth's reading glasses were still on the nightstand. But I'm a man who fixes things. That's not a metaphor. That's literally what I am. And there is something about a broken thing that a certain kind of person cannot leave alone. By the second week, I'd repaired the porch steps. By the third, I'd cleared the collapsed ceiling section, tarped the hole, and started assessing what lumber from the old barn could be salvaged. I rewired the service panel from the road using materials I had Darnell, the man at the hardware store in Crab Orchard, deliver twice a week. I paid him from the $300 I had in my wallet and the small emergency fund I kept in a separate savings account. Marcus didn't know about. Ruth had always said to keep something back, and I'd listened even when I thought I was just humoring her. Darnell was a quiet man in his late 50s who didn't ask a lot of questions and answered the ones I did ask with exactly the number of words necessary. He knew the property, knew the family history of the area, knew which neighbors might have extra materials or be willing to trade labor. He drove a truck with 200,000 miles on it and handled it like new. "Who owns the old Morrison place up the road?" I asked him one afternoon, meaning the larger farm I could see from the hill behind the house. "The Morrison family sold it 15 years ago. Some company out of Nashville bought it. They drilled a few test holes and then went quiet." He handed me a coil of 12-gauge wire. Nobody knows what they were looking for. Rumor's always been gas. I filed that away and didn't think about it again for several weeks. What kept me going during those first months wasn't hope. It was a more basic thing, the particular pride of a man who has been told he is useless, being unable to stop proving otherwise. I fixed the front door frame. I rehung the kitchen cabinets level for the first time in probably 40 years. I found an old set of hand tools in a locked chest in the barn that had belonged to Ruth's grandfather, an oil field worker in a different era, and the quality of them made me sit down on an overturned bucket and hold a wrench in my lap for a long time. The town of Crab Orchard is small, fewer than 2,000 people. In a town that size, a stranger doing electrical work on the old Callaway farmhouse doesn't stay a stranger long. Neighbors started appearing on the gravel track, slowing down, stopping. Earl and Patricia Callaway, no relation to the family Ruth's people had bought from, just a common name in that county, brought vegetables from their garden and stayed for coffee made on the wood stove. Their neighbor, Tom Weston, a retired coal company worker with hands like mine, started showing up on Saturday mornings with no stated purpose, picking up a hammer when he saw something that needed doing. "You're a Sparky," Tom said one Saturday, watching me trace a circuit through the wall with a tester. 38 years. He was quiet for a moment. "You know anything about three-phase systems? I've got a shop with an old mill that's been down for 2 years. Every electrician I've brought out has quoted me figures that would choke a horse." I spent a Tuesday looking at his mill. The problem was a corroded neutral bus connection, 2 hours of work at most. I fixed it for the cost of a share of the firewood he was milling. Word, as it does in small places, went further than the firewood. By summer, I had a loose arrangement with 6 households in the area. I kept their electrical systems running. In return, I was fed, supplied, and more importantly included. Patricia started holding me a plate at the monthly community suppers at the Baptist church. Earl started calling to ask my opinion on things having nothing to do with electrical work. I was becoming part of something, slowly and without ceremony, in the way that real belonging always happens. The property itself was transforming too. I'd restored power, water, and heat. The porch was solid. 2 of the 3 upstairs bedrooms had sound floors and functioning windows. I'd planted a kitchen garden on the south side of the house using seeds Patricia gave me and turned soil using a technique I'd watched Ruth use on our Knoxville garden for 30 years. I was living on what I grew and what the community quietly made sure I didn't go without. I owned nothing. I was richer than I'd been in months. It was Earl who first mentioned the subsurface survey to me. He'd attended a county planning meeting where a company called Meridian Resource Group had presented findings from exploratory testing they'd done in the area. The geology of that particular ridge, they said, sat above a formation consistent with significant natural gas deposits, not the spectacular kind that made national news, but the steady, commercially viable kind that energy companies built 20-year contracts around. They want to negotiate mineral rights with landowners, Earl said, watching my face. You own this land, don't you, Harold? The question hit me like a current I hadn't seen in the circuit. I thought about what I knew. I thought about what my attorney had told me about the document Marcus had produced. I thought about the specific language she'd used. Technically legal, if profoundly unethical. And then I thought about something she'd also said, which I'd been too numb to fully process at the time, that the mineral rights transfer on a property of this type, in Tennessee, required a separate, explicit conveyance that met very specific statutory requirements, that bundling it into a general property transfer document without clearly specified language was one of the more common errors she saw in real estate fraud cases. I drove to Knoxville and walked back into her office unannounced. She remembered me. She pulled the documents. She read them again. She was quiet for a long time. Harold, she said, your son transferred the surface rights. He did not validly transfer the mineral rights. This language doesn't meet Tennessee Code Annotated 665101's requirements for mineral severance. These rights are still legally yours. She introduced me that same week to a colleague who specialized in energy law, a serious woman in her 40s named Catherine Marsh, who had handled mineral rights cases across 6 states and whose handshake felt like a closing argument. She reviewed everything. She called Meridian Resource Group. She had a conversation I was not present for but was briefed on afterward. Meridian's initial offer for a 20-year lease on the mineral rights to the 40 acres, with Harold Benton as the sole rightful holder, was $640,000, plus royalties. I sat in Catherine Marsh's office and looked at the number on the paper for a long time without speaking. Is that a lot? I said, which was the same thing I might have said about anything at that point. She smiled. It's enough to rebuild that farmhouse and then some. And the royalties, if the formation produces what Meridian expects, will continue for the life of the lease. I thought about Marcus standing in that clearing, telling me the land was a liability. I thought about Diane at the kitchen island not looking up. I thought about the work boots Marcus had worn that day, the ones that told me he'd already decided before he picked me up that morning. Then I thought about Earl and Patricia, about Tom Weston's mill running again, about the kids at the Baptist church suppers who'd started calling me Mr. Harold like I was someone whose name was worth learning. I signed the Meridian lease in September. I did not call Marcus. He found out through the county records office, which he apparently monitored. I don't know what he felt when he saw my name on that mineral rights agreement instead of his. I know what he did, because the phone started ringing that same evening and didn't stop. The first call came at 6:47. I was sitting on the porch watching the sun drop behind the western ridge, drinking coffee from a mug Patricia had given me, the first new thing anyone had given me in a year that wasn't charity but felt like love. I looked at Marcus's name on the screen and I put the phone face down on the porch railing. He called again at 7, at 7:20, at 8. By 10 o'clock he'd called 11 times. By the next afternoon the count was 31. 31 attempts to reach the father he'd dropped at a rotting farmhouse in March with a duffel bag and the information that he'd be in touch about next steps. His voicemails moved through stages the way grief does, if grief were entirely self-directed. The first ones were controlled. Dad, call me back. There's been a misunderstanding about the property documentation. Then they got urgent. Dad, I think there's been some kind of error with the county records. We need to talk before you do anything else. Then, desperate. Dad, please. I know things have been difficult. I know I made mistakes. Just please call me. Then, in the last several, something closer to honest. Dad, I've lost the dealership partnership. Diane's father pulled out. She's talking about leaving. I don't know what I'm doing. I don't know how things got this far. Please. I listened to every one of them. I did not return a single call. He appeared on the gravel track one Saturday morning in October, 3 weeks after the calls began. I heard a car I didn't recognize. The truck was gone, apparently, the one he'd driven me out in. And when I came around from the side of the house where I'd been working on a fence, I almost didn't recognize him. He'd lost weight. The pressed look he'd always had was gone, replaced by something wrinkled and unsettled. He looked like a man who'd been sleeping badly and blaming it on the mattress rather than the mirror. Dad. His voice was careful, like something he'd rehearsed but wasn't sure he'd gotten right. You could have called ahead, I said. I'd have made coffee. That seemed to destabilize him. I think he'd been prepared for anger and wasn't sure what to do with the absence of it. I need to talk to you. You've been talking to my voicemail for 3 weeks. What's different today? He looked at the house. It was visibly different from the ruin he'd left me at. The porch was straight, the windows were whole, smoke was coming from the chimney in a thin, steady line. He looked at it the way people look at things they underestimated, which is to say with a kind of complicated grief. The mineral rights, he said. You know, we didn't mean to exclude those from the transfer document. I know what you meant to do. Dad, if you'd just let me explain. Marcus. I said his name with the particular quietness that Ruth had always said was the signal that I was done accommodating. I know exactly how those documents were structured. I know exactly what you counted on when you handed them to me. You counted on a 63-year-old man who'd just buried his wife to sign whatever you put in front of him because he trusted his son and couldn't see straight through his grief. He opened his mouth. I kept going. You were right that I trusted you. You were wrong about what that meant. You thought it meant you could take what you wanted, and I'd be too broken to notice. What it actually meant was that I spent 38 years teaching you that when something breaks, you don't walk away from it. You figure out the problem and you fix it. I gestured at the house behind me. I've been fixing things. I know that. And I'm proud of. I think what you've done here is. I don't need you to be proud of me, I said. I needed that about 40 years ago. Now I just need you to understand that this conversation isn't going to go the way you're hoping. His face changed. The rehearsed quality dropped out of it, and something raw took its place. The mineral rights are worth a lot of money, Dad. Half should be ours. Whatever the documents say, morally, this was supposed to be a family asset. Was it a family asset when you drove me out here in March and left me with a bag of clothes and canned soup? He was quiet. Was it a family asset when you called it a liability property for a year while you were planning how to get my signature on a transfer document? More quiet. Was your mother's china a family asset? Because I noticed Diane took that when she packed up the guest room before you drove me out here. Something shifted in him then, not a transformation. Nothing so clean as that, but a crack in the certainty he'd arrived with. He sat down on the porch steps that I had rebuilt with heart pine from the barn, without being invited, like a man whose legs had simply stopped cooperating. I've made every mistake it's possible to make, he said. I know that. Diane's leaving. The partnership fell through. I'm looking at the last 5 years of my life and I can see every point where I chose wrong. He looked up at me. I'm asking for a chance. I looked at my son, my actual son, the one underneath all the bad decisions, the one I'd driven to baseball practice and helped with college applications and danced with at his wedding, and I felt the full weight of what had been broken between us. Not anger, something heavier. Grief, maybe, for the particular relationship that doesn't get to go back to what it was even when both people want it to. A chance at what, exactly? I asked. At being your son again, at making this right. You can be my son, I said. That's not something you get to lose entirely. But making this right isn't a single conversation. It's not a check or an apology or showing up on my porch because you've run out of other options. It's years of being a different person than you've been. I sat down in the porch chair that Tom Weston had helped me build from the barn salvage. I'm not closing that door, but I'm not walking back through it today, either. He nodded slowly. Like a man accepting terms he couldn't negotiate. He left an hour later, back down the gravel track, dust settling behind him in the October light. I sat on that porch for a long time after the sound of his engine faded. Below the ridge, the county road ran quiet. Somewhere up the hill, the old cistern was full from the week's rain, gravity doing the patient work of bringing water down to where it was needed. Tom Weston would be here in the morning. Earl had left me half a bushel of apples from his orchard. Patricia was bringing 2 of her grandchildren on Sunday to see the garden, which had produced more tomatoes than I could eat and had been feeding half the neighborhood since August. I thought about the Meridian contract in the folder on the kitchen table. I thought about the phone calls from the company in Nashville that Catherine Marsh had begun fielding on my behalf, asking about community development partnerships. I thought about the conversation Earl and I had started having about bringing reliable electrical service to 3 households in the area that were still running off old panels that were a fire risk every winter. I have made decisions with the money that Marcus did not expect and would not have made himself. A portion went to upgrade the electrical infrastructure for the 6 households I'd been working with since March. A portion went into a trust for Marcus's children, my grandchildren, that they can access when they turn 25, structured in a way that requires a conversation with an attorney to touch, because I want them to know where it came from and why I kept it for them even when their father didn't. The rest is in an account Ruth would have said was sensible to keep, which is high praise from a woman who once made a household budget on a napkin and stuck to it for 11 years. The farmhouse is no longer an abandoned house. It is the place I live. It is the place people come on Saturday mornings with hammers and on Sunday afternoons with covered dishes. It is the place where I have, in the last year, become more genuinely myself than I was in the decade before Ruth died, when I was comfortable in the way that mistakes to be comfortable. I think about Marcus sometimes when I'm working late in the evenings, tracing a new circuit or fitting a junction box. I think about the version of him that existed before the bad decisions compounded into the man who drove me out here in work boots he'd bought that morning. I don't know if that version is still in there, working its way back toward the surface. I hope it is. He sent a letter in December. Not an email, a letter, handwritten on plain white paper that had been folded 3 times and mailed to the Crab Orchard post office box I'd set up. He did not ask for money. He did not ask for forgiveness in the sense of absolution. He said he was working for a general contractor outside of Nashville, and that he'd started going to a counselor on Tuesday mornings. He said his children were doing all right. He said he'd driven past the old house in Knoxville and seen that new people had moved in and put flower boxes in the windows, and that it had been hard to see, but that he understood why I'd sold it rather than keep it and what it stood for. He ended the letter by saying that he'd finally read the electrician's manual I'd given him when he turned 18, the one he'd thanked me for and immediately put in a closet. He said he understood now that I hadn't given it to him because I expected him to become an electrician. I'd given it to him because I wanted him to understand how systems work, how every connection matters, how one bad joint, left uncorrected, can take down the whole circuit. I have not written back yet. Some repairs take longer than others. Some circuits need to be fully de-energized before you can safely touch them. But I know how to do this kind of work. I've been doing it for 38 years. The porch faces west, and in the evenings the light comes through the trees in long bars and falls across the floorboards. I planed and refinished by hand over 4 winter weekends. Ruth would have loved it here. She'd have had the garden covering twice the ground in half the time, and she'd have known every neighbor's birthday by the end of the first month. She always was the better half of this particular circuit. But I am still here, still working, still fixing what's broken. And this piece of land that my son called a liability, this 40 acres of hill country that he counted on nobody wanting, turns out to be exactly where I belong. Life has a way of doing that, putting you precisely where you need to be, in the most inconvenient and unexpected way possible. And if that sounds like something a man says to make peace with a hard story, I want you to know it isn't. I say it because I'm sitting on this porch in the last light of a Tuesday in January, with good coffee and warm boots and the smell of wood smoke and pine, and not one single thing in my life right now was handed to me or taken from me by anyone else. I built this, same as I've always done, with my own 2 hands. If this story has stayed with you, I'd be glad if you'd subscribe and leave a comment telling me where you're watching from. Real stories are what we do here, the ones that don't tie up perfectly but end somewhere true. Maybe yours is the one that helps someone else find their footing when they've lost it. Thank you for listening.